All right, welcome to the deep dive. Today, we're going deep on something you guys have been asking a lot about.
Yeah, I've seen it too. Lots of questions about this.
It's a big one, China. You want to understand how they became this huge techno-industrial power, right?
Right.
So to do that, you sent over a ton of fascinating stuff. We've got analyses of how their economy and their tech scene has developed, the history of how the US and China have interacted over the years, and even deep dives on specific industries where China is now calling the shots. So, in this deep dive, our mission, if you will,
I like it.
is to break down exactly how China pulled off this transformation, the key strategies they used along the way,
Absolutely.
and what it all means for the way the world works today, the whole global power dynamic. Basically, think of this as a crash course on one of the most important shifts happening in our lifetime.
It's a big one for sure. I think when we step back and look at the past few decades, China becoming this leading technological and industrial power, it's arguably a bigger deal than even the Soviet Union was during the Cold War.
So it's not just that China's big now, but it's how they got there that's different from how the Soviets did things.
Exactly. And a key difference that comes up a lot in the material you provided
Okay.
is that the Soviets never really reached this level of, well, I guess you'd call it techno-industrial sophistication across the board.
Interesting. So let's rewind a bit, set the stage historically, go back in time a little. A lot of what you shared points to the fall of the Soviet Union as a turning point for China.
For sure.
But it wasn't just about the shift in global power, right? Like who's on top. There was something else going on.
Right. It was deeper than that.
Yeah.
The sources really emphasized that China was watching closely, and they learned from what happened to the Soviets.
Learn from their mistakes, maybe.
Exactly. Especially how the Soviet model, with its rigid ideology, ended up holding back their tech and economic progress.
So being stuck in their ways.
Yeah, exactly. And this observation, this lesson, it became central to Deng Xiaoping's reforms. He prioritized practical, tangible progress in technology and economics. But it's important to remember, this wasn't just about getting richer.
Right.
It was tied to a much deeper national aspiration, this idea of restoring what they saw as China's rightful place in history,
Kind of like a comeback story.
Yeah, I guess you could say that.
Yeah.
Overcoming what they call the century of shame, that period where they felt weakened by Western powers.
It's powerful stuff. So this drive wasn't just about economics. It was about history and ambition.
Absolutely.
And there's this other thing that jumped out at me from the material. It's this early alignment with the West after decades of, tension.
Yeah.
I mean, it's almost surprising considering the history.
Right. Well, remember, after Nixon and Kissinger opened things up, China, even under Mao, started building this strategic relationship with the West. It was pragmatic. Yes. Practical, exactly. Their goal was to use Western powers to help their own development, but always on their own terms. China was never going to just become a mini-West. They had their own distinct approach, their own way of doing things.
No, here's where it gets really interesting. The stuff you shared shows how the existing global order, the one led by the West,
Right.
it actually helped China rise, in some ways even against its own core beliefs.
Yeah.
We're talking about the World Bank, even Wall Street. How did that happen?
It's fascinating, right? The established players, the World Bank, they embraced China. In May 1980, China re-entered the World Bank. And under Deng Xiaoping, there was this massive shift away from the old Soviet-style, centrally planned economy. They started moving towards what's often called a Western model of state capitalism.
Okay, break that down for me a bit.
Sure. So it's an economy where the state, the government, is still heavily involved, but it operates within a market system.
Got it. So not pure free markets, but not the total government control like the Soviets had either.
Exactly. And this shift was deliberate. They sent economists to study Western theories, how the World Bank worked. It was a learning process.
Wow, so they were really studying the West.
They were. And not only that, the World Bank actively encouraged this shift. They even guided it. And it's interesting because some might say that goes against some basic free market principles, right?
Yeah, like if you believe in a hands-off approach to the economy, this doesn't seem to fit.
Exactly. But that's what happened. In 1985, the World Bank released this report, China Economic Structure in International Perspective.
Okay.
And they explicitly advocated for state capitalism in China, with the Communist Party still in control, guiding things.
That's pretty surprising.
It is. And they didn't just say, hey, try this out. They gave specific recommendations. They said China should prioritize high-volume manufacturing, especially in high-tech areas, encourage Foreign investment, FDI.
Foreign direct investment.
Yeah, FDI, exactly. And they said China should allow that in advanced technologies within these special economic zones, these SEZs. And they pushed for China to set up international branches of their state-owned enterprises, or SOEs.
So it's almost like the West was handing China a playbook on how to build their economy.
That's a good way to put it.
Yeah.
And this collaboration wasn't just some vague agreement between governments. It was happening on a personal level, on specific projects.
Like between individuals.
Yes. For example, Zhu Xiaochuan, the head of China's central bank, worked directly with Peter Harold, an economist at the World Bank. They worked on SOE reform, and they specifically rejected the idea of just privatizing everything. They wanted a different approach.
Interesting. So not just handing over state-owned companies to private owners.
Exactly. And to top it off, the current Chinese premier, Li Keqiang, you know him, right?
I know the name.
Well, he co-authored this really influential report, China 2030, with the World Bank. So again, you see this collaboration shaping China's development.
So the West wasn't just giving money or opening doors to institutions. They were actively involved in crafting China's economic policy.
That's right. And we can't forget the U.S. itself played a big role. They supported China's entry into the WTO, which gave them access to this huge global trading system.
And that fueled their growth, right?
Absolutely. But some people say in doing this, the U.S. overlooked its own rules about free and fair trade. China, at that time, didn't fully meet all the criteria.
I see. So kind of bending the rules a bit.
Some would say so.
Yeah.
This period is sometimes called the Beijing Consensus, a different model of development than the more hands-off Washington Consensus.
Okay, so we've covered how the West provided financial and institutional support and even gave them access to their markets. But what about the actual technology? The sources suggest the U.S. played a part in that too, especially early on.
You're right. There was technology transfer happening. The material shows that the U.S., particularly under Reagan, was open to sending certain conventional defense technologies to China.
Conventional, meaning not nuclear.
Correct. Not the super high-tech stuff. A declassified document from 1981, National Security Decision Directive No. 11, laid out this approach. They wanted to strengthen China's regular military to counterbalance the Soviet Union. But they were very clear about what they wouldn't share, things like submarines, intelligence systems, and of course anything nuclear.
So the logic was a stronger, more modern China would be good for global stability, especially with the Cold War going on.
Exactly. They wanted China to be independent and stable. And another document from 1984, National Security Decision Directive 140, talks about the goals for Reagan's visit to China.
Okay.
And it mentions encouraging economic liberalization, building ties with democratic countries, and helping China modernize.
So a multi-pronged strategy, not just military support.
Right. But this whole technology transfer thing wasn't without its problems.
Yeah.
The sources you provided highlight some pretty big controversies where people started asking serious questions.
Give me an example.
Sure. In 1998, there was this investigation into General Motors, Hughes Electronics, and Loral Space and Communication.
Big names.
Yeah. They were accused of illegally transferring sensitive satellite technology to China after a launch failed. Loral Space was even accused of doing so with express presidential permission, which President Clinton denied. But he did acknowledge that his administration was basically continuing Reagan's policy and acting in the best interests of the U.S.
So some murky waters there. It wasn't just civilian tech with possible military uses either. There was some direct military tech involved too, right?
Right. In 1999, President Clinton authorized the transfer of tech related to satellite fuel and explosive bolts, things that could potentially be used in intercontinental ballistic missiles.
Wow. So that raised some eyebrows, I'm sure.
Definitely. And then in 2003, the U.S. State Department actually charged Hughes Corporation and Boeing Satellite Systems with illegal space technology transfer. It ended up with a huge settlement, and the companies admitted they might have harmed U.S. security.
So while the U.S. was trying to help China modernize, it seems like sometimes they went too far.
Yeah, and the long-term consequences were maybe not fully considered. But here's another key point from the material. The U.S. wasn't just handing over their crown jewels, their most advanced tech.
Yeah.
So China started looking for other ways to get their hands on that stuff.
Other means, as the sources put it?
Exactly. It's clear that while official channels gave them some access, they knew it wasn't enough.
So they got creative.
They did. You see accusations of espionage, trying to steal designs for U.S. nuclear weapons, Predator drones, the F-35 and F-22 stealth fighters.
I mean, that's some next-level stuff.
It is. But it wasn't just Chinese intelligence operations doing this. They were working through third parties, too.
Other countries.
Sometimes. A good example is Jonathan Pollard, an Israeli spy who was caught in 1985 giving classified U.S. intel to Israel, some of which reportedly ended up in China's hands. There's a bigger example.
Okay.
In the mid-90s, the CIA director at the time, R. James Woolsey, he straight up said that Israel had been giving China billions of dollars worth of military tech for over a decade.
Wow, billions.
Billions. We're talking advanced jets, missiles, tanks, the whole works.
So it was a much bigger network than just the U.S. and China.
It was. And other U.S. allies got involved too. France, Britain, they were all exporting arms to China. It added up to over $4 billion by 2012. Then there's the whole thing with the PLA, the Chinese military, setting up subsidiaries in the U.S.
Wait, the Chinese military had companies here in the U.S.?
Yeah. On paper, they were there to get investment, technology, maybe even intelligence. They faced more scrutiny and restrictions after 1998, but even then, a Congressional Research Service report listed a bunch of PLA-linked companies operating in the U.S., companies with names like Poly Technologies and Cayley Corporation.
And some of these companies weren't just passively acquiring tech.
No, they got their hands dirty. In 1996, the FBI busted 2 PRC companies, Poly Technologies again, and Arinco, trying to smuggle AK-47s through Oakland.
So it was a mix of everything, from official partnerships and Western support to technology transfers and some shady dealings. It's a pretty wild story.
It is, and it all built the foundation for China's techno-industrial power. But the sources also make a point of saying how much of this development happened quietly, under the radar. They call it a stealthy rise.
They were building this whole techno-economic empire without making a lot of noise.
Exactly. And it all goes back to that long-term vision we talked about earlier, the goal of restoring China to greatness, maybe even changing the whole global order. It's a bold ambition. And here's the thing. They've gotten to a point where the U.S. can't just disentangle itself from China without causing serious problems.
That tangled web.
Exactly. The global economy is so intertwined that trying to decouple would hurt everyone, including the U.S. economy.
Okay, so let's get specific. The sources you sent highlight a few sectors where China is now dominant. The first one is rare earth elements, those critical minerals. It's something we touched on in our Chips War episode, but there's so much more to it.
Oh, absolutely. The sheer scale of China's control in this area is mind-blowing.
Yeah.
They're the top producer for 16 out of the 35 critical minerals the U.S. Geological Survey has identified as vital. And we're talking near monopolies in some cases: yttrium, gallium, magnesium, tungsten, bismuth, antimony, and of course all the rare earth elements.
And these aren't just obscure metals, right? They're in all sorts of things.
They are. And it's not just those. China also has a huge share of production for other essential materials like graphite, germanium, tellurium, indium, vanadium, and fluorspar. They're everywhere.
And where does the U.S. stand in all this?
It's a stark contrast, frankly. The U.S. is the top producer for only 2 of these 35 critical minerals, beryllium and helium. And for 22 others, we don't produce any at all domestically. That's a huge vulnerability, especially when you consider how reliant we are on these materials for high-tech stuff and military tech.
The material really drives this home. It talks about how everything from cruise missiles to the F-35 fighter jet needs these rare earth elements that come from China. And it mentions that each F-35 has something like 920 pounds of these materials.
Yeah, it's a crazy amount. It
Yeah.
really shows you how interconnected everything is and how much leverage China has. Now, let's shift gears to semiconductors.
The tech war.
Exactly. The U.S. has been trying to restrict China's access to the technology they need to make advanced chips, right?
Right. And the material lays out a timeline. It starts with the Trump administration going after Fuji and Jinhua back in 2018, and then this big push to stop ASML, that Dutch company, from selling their most advanced lithography machines to China.
Yeah, and it's only escalated from there. Restrictions on selling tech to companies like Sepmic and Hikvision starting in 2020. Then Sepmic gets blacklisted in December of that year, stop them from getting the tech to make chips at 10 nanometers or smaller.
And that 10 nanometer node, that's the bleeding edge, right? The most advanced chips.
Exactly. And the U.S. even put pressure on ASML in Japan to stop sending older DUV lithography machines to China. But ASML is really the key here because they practically have a monopoly on EUV lithography, which you need for those cutting-edge chips.
I'm not a tech expert, but isn't EUV basically using a super precise light pen to etch tiny circuits onto the silicon?
You got it. It's way more precise than the older DUV methods, allowing for more powerful and efficient chips. So without access to ASML's EUV tech, it's really hard to make those top-of-the-line chips. And even though Chinese companies like SMEC and Huawei have made some progress despite these restrictions, they're still way behind.
Yeah, the ASML CEO even said publicly that China is probably 10 to 15 years behind in advanced lithography. It's a huge gap.
It is. And while SMIC managed to make 7 class chips for Huawei using DUV, it's not the same as having EUV. They're working around the restrictions, but they're not closing the gap at the highest level.
But they're fighting back, right? The
Yeah,
material talks about China stepping up their game in the tech war.
they are. They've got this DeepSeek AI platform and a massive 37 billion euro investment initiative aimed at breaking ASML's hold on EUV. But it's like a race where the finish line keeps moving. As China tries to catch up with EUV, the West is already working on the next generation, high-NA and hyper-NA EUV lithography.
So it never really ends.
No, it doesn't. And companies like TSMC in Taiwan and Intel are already getting those cutting-edge tools as they work towards making 1 nanometer chips. That's the next frontier.
But here's something interesting from the material. Even with the challenges in semiconductor manufacturing, China has become a powerhouse in other interconnected sectors, particularly in electric vehicles.
That's a crucial point. They're not putting all their eggs in one basket. They've been building up these huge companies in other areas.
Like batteries.
Batteries, yes. Companies like CATL and BYD are leading the charge, no pun intended, in the global EV battery market. And even companies like Xiaomi, known for their smartphones, are jumping into the EV game.
So they're leveraging their expertise in other areas.
Exactly. Plus, China already has this massive industrial base. They're the world's largest producer of steel, aluminum, petrochemicals, all essential for making EVs. They have a built-in advantage.
It's like they have all the pieces.
They do. And now Chinese companies are making key EV components, the motor controllers, the LiDAR, radar, cameras, sensor systems, all the stuff needed for self-driving. They can compete head-to-head with companies like Tesla.
So they're not just assembling cars, they're building the whole ecosystem.
Exactly. Now let's talk about biotech and pharma. China plays a huge role in making active pharmaceutical ingredients, APIs, the active ingredients in drugs.
And they're the main supplier globally, right?
They are, especially for generic medications. Some estimates say they supply over 90% of certain critical APIs, the ones for common drugs like penicillin and ibuprofen. A lot of countries, including the U.S., rely heavily on China for these ingredients.
And that reliance creates some strategic issues, especially with the U.S. having this huge trade deficit in pharmaceuticals.
Absolutely. China, being a major exporter of APIs and generics, contributes to that deficit.
Right.
And here's another layer of complexity. India, a major supplier of generic drugs to the U.S., gets most of their APIs from China, something like 65–70%. It's a tangled web.
So it's not just a U.S.-China issue, it's a global issue.
Exactly. Some people argue that instead of just slapping tariffs on China, the U.S. should be working with India to diversify their API supply chains. It would be a more strategic approach.
So collaboration, not just confrontation.
Right. And it's important to note that U.S. pharma companies are mostly focused on developing new drugs, the innovative stuff.
And generics are made elsewhere.
Largely in India and China, yeah.
Yeah.
But China's not just making generics. They're also becoming a major player in CRISPR gene editing tech.
That's the tech that can change DNA, right?
Yes, it has applications in agriculture, animal research, and even human medicine, like cancer treatments.
So really cutting-edge stuff.
It is. And while the core CRISPR technology came from U.S. and European scientists, China has adopted it rapidly and is doing a lot of their own research. There was that controversial case with Hejiang Kui using CRISPR on human embryos.
Yeah, I remember that.
And it's worth mentioning the work of Ralph Baric, a top U.S. virologist who specializes in coronaviruses. He's collaborated with researchers at the Wuhan Institute of Virology, and they've done work on using reverse genetics to create chimeric viruses, basically combining different viruses for research purposes.
Fascinating and a little scary.
Yeah, it's definitely cutting-edge science with big implications.
So to sum up this whole deep dive, China's rise to this techno-industrial power has been intentional and multifaceted. They worked with the West, especially early on, but they also pursued their own development and sometimes weren't afraid to bend the rules to get what they wanted.
That's a great summary. From using history to fuel their ambitions to adopting this model of state capitalism with input from the West. From getting tech through both official and unofficial channels to dominating key sectors like rare earths, EVs, and APIs, they've pulled off a truly impressive transformation.
It's been a wild ride learning about all this. It really shows how interconnected the world is and how complex China's rise has been. Now, a final thought for you, the listener. Given where China is now and their big goals for the future, what do you think will happen next in this global competition for technology and economic power? What are the possible scenarios? And are there any wildcards, things we haven't even thought of that could change everything? We challenge you to think about the delicate balance between countries working together, competing with each other, and protecting their own interests in this constantly shifting world. Thanks for joining us on this deep dive.
China, huh? I mean, it feels like for, what, decades now? The story's always been the same. Crazy growth, unstoppable, like a juggernaut just reshaping the world. But lately, things feel, I don't know, different.
Yeah, definitely a shift. Kind of cooled off, especially post-pandemic, right? Makes you wonder if that whole miracle was built on, I don't know, shaky ground. Like, are we about to see a Chinese bubble burst?
That's exactly what we're going to dig into today. And we've got a really interesting stack of sources to, you know, dissect what's actually going on in China right now.
Absolutely. So in this deep dive, we're cutting through the noise, right? Getting to the heart of it. We're talking about deflation, which is a big one, the debt that's fueled so much of China's rise, and then the long-term challenges, like what's coming down the pipeline.
Yeah, the big question, I guess, is what does all this mean for the future of China, right? Like, where do they go from here? But first, let's start with what's been making headlines. Deflation.
Consumer Price Index, so CPI, that's the cost of, stuff for everyday folks, it barely moved in December. Like just 0.1% year on year, weakest it's been since March.
That's rough.
And then there's PPI, the Producer Price Index. This is what manufacturers are getting for their goods. It's actually been negative, falling 2.3% year on year. And here's the kicker. This has been happening for 27 months straight.
27 months. That's not just a little dip. That's a trend. And this is while the government's trying to, jumpstart things with stimulus, right?
Exactly. Even with all that, consumer inflation has actually been slowing down for, 4 months in a row, suggests that the demand just isn't there, I mean, there is a little bit of a bright side. Core CPI, which excludes food and energy, has ticked up a bit, so maybe, underlying demand isn't totally gone. But yeah, the deflationary pressure is definitely there.
Definitely a red flag.
Yeah.
And then there's also the whole thing with the Chinese yuan weakening, right? How does that fit in?
You're thinking like an economist. So the yuan weakening against the US dollar, it's hit a 16-month low. It often reflects these deeper deflationary issues. And, it shows this uncertainty about the economy. A weaker yuan can make Chinese exports cheaper, which is good for them on the global market, but it can also signal a lack of confidence back home.
So basically, things aren't looking so hot.
Mm-hmm.
But to understand why, we need to, zoom out a bit, right? Look at how China's growth has worked.
You got it. This isn't just some random blip. It's connected to a growth model that's been, hooked on debt and a focus on manufacturing for export, not for, the people within China buying stuff.
Yeah, the debt-fueled growth thing. It's been a huge story for years.
Right, so check out these numbers. Corporate debt in China is 164% of GDP. Government debt, 44%. Households, also 44%. That adds up to a total debt to GDP ratio over 250% in 2024.
Yikes. It's a lot.
And to compare, back in 2019, it was 257%. So yeah, it's slightly down, but the actual amount of debt has gone way up as the economy's grown.
And I can't help but think about that massive stimulus after the 2008 crisis, right? Didn't that play a role?
Big time. So to deal with 2008, China went all out, pumping in a huge amount, like $800 billion. That's 13% of their GDP at the time. Way more than what the US or Japan did. The goal was to keep the growth going, and it worked in the short term, mostly by pouring money into infrastructure and real estate.
So it kind of kicked the can down the road, solved one problem, but created another.
Yeah, you could say that. That $800 billion stopped a complete collapse, but it also kind of set the stage for this massive debt we see now. It led to the situation where businesses were making way more stuff than people actually needed.
Oversupply. Classic Econ 101.
Exactly. And what happens then? Prices go down, profit margins shrink, and the whole system becomes less efficient. We're talking about a 3% drop in profit margins for companies.
Ouch. And I'm guessing the state-owned enterprises, the SOEs, were right in the thick of it, given how closely they're tied to the government.
Oh yeah, they were key. After 2008, Beijing basically leaned on SOEs to carry out that stimulus. State-controlled banks were told to lend huge amounts to these SOEs, who then went and built more factories, bought more equipment, often without even checking if there was a market for all this stuff.
Just build it for the sake of building, huh?
Pretty much. And now SOEs hold about half of China's corporate debt and account for 22% of the GDP. So yeah, they definitely made the overcapacity problem worse. They don't play by the same rules as private companies,
And then there's this whole other layer of lending going on, right? The shadow banking system. What exactly is that?
So while most lending happens through those big state-controlled banks, there's also this whole network of smaller banks, provincial ones, and other non-bank lenders. They're less regulated, more risky, and that's what we call shadow banking.
Sounds kind of shady, honestly.
A little bit, yeah. And its growth has been insane, from like $80 billion in 2006 to, get this, $3.8 trillion by 2016. So it's a lot harder to get a clear picture of how much debt is really out there because of the shadow banking thing.
And how risky is it? Like, what about non-performing loans? Is that a big concern?
Officially, China says NPLs, non-performing loans, are pretty low, like around 1.6%. That's similar to the US and actually better than India.
Huh, interesting.
But because of that shadow banking thing, it's hard to know for sure. There's this worry that a lot of bad loans are hidden, not being reported. So the official numbers might not be the whole story.
So the government's got to be aware of this whole debt situation, right?
Yeah.
They've tried to do something about it, haven't they?
For sure. They know it's a problem and they've taken steps. Like in their 13th five-year plan, which ended in 2020, they specifically talked about cutting production in sectors like coal and steel, industries with tons of debt.
Trying to scale back, I guess.
Yeah. They even set up a 100 billion RMB fund to help workers who lost their jobs because of these cuts. There was supposed to be like 1.8 million of them. Then there was the 2015 bond swap program, where local governments could swap their old kind of shady debts for more transparent bonds. By May 2016, they'd done about $240 billion in swaps. And then in late 2016, they cracked down on SOE investments in overseeing real estate, trying to, control the debt growth.
Sounds like they're trying to pump the brakes, but it's hard when the whole system's been running on debt for so long.
Yeah.
And this brings us to another big idea, the middle income trap.
Right. This is a big one. Basically, it's this thing where a developing country hits a certain income level, usually around like $10,000 to $12,000 GDP per capita. They lose their edge in exporting because wages go up, but they're not yet making those high-value products and services to become a truly developed economy.
So they're stuck kind of in between.
Exactly. Like a runner who's great at sprinting but can't run a marathon. They can't keep up that initial growth forever.
And hasn't China basically reached that upper middle income level?
They have. And that's why the recent slowdown in GDP growth is such a big deal. In June 2023, growth was just 0.8%, compared to 2.2% in the first quarter of the year. And our sources suggest this isn't just a post-COVID slump. It's linked to this huge real estate bubble that's been building for like 2 decades.
A bubble that's starting to deflate.
Yeah.
Right. And we've seen some pretty scary headlines about the real estate market crashing.
Yeah, the numbers are rough. New home sales by the top 100 developers in China were down a whopping 33% in July year on year. And that's even with the government trying to boost things. And then you have these high-profile cases like Evergrande, which reportedly lost something like $81 billion in just 2 years and is now going bankrupt. Even Country Garden, which was supposed to be more stable, defaulted on its bonds.
So it's not just a few bad apples. This is systemic.
Yeah, and remember those local government financing vehicles, the LGFEs? They're another big part of the debt problem. These are entities set up by local governments to, raise money for projects without directly borrowing. And they've racked up a ton of debt, over 59 trillion yuan, which is basically half of China's GDP.
It's like they've created this whole parallel system of debt.
Kinda, yeah. And then you add youth unemployment to the mix, and it gets even more worrying. The unemployment rate for 16 to 24-year-olds hit 21.3% in June 2023.
That's insane.
And some analysts say the real number could be even higher, like 46.5% if you include all the young people who've just given up looking for work.
Wow. So you've got a generation coming of age with no jobs, a real estate market in free fall, and this mountain of debt hanging over everything. It's like a perfect storm.
It is, and it's happening while China's still a middle-income country, unlike Japan, whose bubble burst after they'd already become a developed nation. So yeah, it's a really precarious situation.
And to understand it better, our sources break down China's growth model into these 3 phases. Can you walk us through those?
Okay, so countries that rely on high savings and investment, like China has, tend to go through these 3 stages. First, they pump money into infrastructure, roads, bridges, all that. This leads to fast growth, but it's often unbalanced. And they take on debt, but it's manageable because the returns on those investments are high.
Makes sense. So what's the second phase?
In phase 2, they try to shift away from just infrastructure and exports, but they end up relying more on real estate, which is often fueled by, more debt. And this is where China seems to be stuck right now. Between 1980 and 2010, their GDP quadrupled, but their debt was pretty low. But from 2010 to 2020, while GDP doubled, debt tripled, was officially over $43 trillion, or 280% of GDP by 2020. And now some say it could be as high as 360%.
So the debt's growing way faster than the economy. Not good.
Not good at all. And then there's the third phase, the ideal one. This is where they finally rebalance, focusing on more sophisticated manufacturing, services, things like that. Productivity goes up and people start spending more domestically. This is how they escape the middle income trap and become a fully developed economy.
But that's the hard part, right?
Yeah, very few countries have pulled it off. Japan and South Korea are the classic examples.
And China's been talking about wanting to become more consumer-driven, haven't they? Like boosting domestic spending?
Yeah, that's the official line. They want to increase the share of household income in GDP from like 50% to 70% and raise wages. But with the economy slowing down and all this debt, it's gonna be tough.
So what are the roadblocks? What's stopping them from making that leap?
Well, first, they need to move up the value chain in manufacturing. They can't just keep making cheap stuff. With the labor force shrinking, they need to focus on more capital-intensive industries, high-tech stuff. And that means investing in R&D, protecting intellectual property, all that good stuff.
And wasn't there a World Bank report a while back that basically laid out a roadmap for China?
Yeah, back in 2012, the World Bank teamed up with China's Development Research Center and put out this report called China 2030. It was pretty detailed, talking about completing the transition to a market economy, giving private companies more space, tackling corruption, strengthening the rule of law.
It sounds like solid advice.
It was. But China hasn't really followed it. Instead, they've focused on things like the Belt and Road Initiative, which, as we'll talk about later, is kind of like exporting their old growth model.
And of course, the global economy isn't exactly helping, right? It's slowing down, and there are all these trade tensions.
Totally. A weaker global economy means less demand for Chinese exports. And then you have the U.S. sanctions on things like semiconductors, which makes it harder for China to move into those high-tech sectors. Plus, all the tariffs and the whole de-risking thing where other countries are trying to reduce their dependence on China.
And some people are even talking about a potential Japanification of the Chinese economy, right? Mm-hmm. What did that actually mean?
Japanification basically means that China could end up like Japan after its bubble burst in the late 80s, early 90s. Low growth, deflation, maybe even a balance sheet recession.
Well, lost decade or maybe even decades.
Yeah, something like that. But it's important to remember that China's not Japan. They're still a middle-income country. Their industries are different. Their social safety net isn't as strong, so it wouldn't be exactly the same.
And our sources also mentioned some specific examples of, like, really heavy debt burdens, like the high-speed rail network.
Right, so China's built this incredible high-speed rail system, but it's come at a huge cost. By 2020, the debt had reached like $850 billion. And a lot of these lines, especially in less populated areas, aren't making enough money to cover their costs.
So it's a shiny new toy, but it's costing them a fortune.
Yeah, pretty much. And to make things even more interesting, China just announced they're issuing a record 3 trillion yuan in special treasury bonds for 2025. It's a huge stimulus effort trying to fight deflation and boost the economy. But of course, it means more debt.
So they're in a tough spot. They need to stimulate the economy, but every time they do, it adds to the debt problem. And that brings us to the global implications. What happens to the rest of the world if China keeps going down this path?
It's a big deal. There's this Bloomberg article that talks about how investors are increasingly worried about a deflationary spiral in China, like what happened in Japan. And the fact that Chinese bond yields are so low, even with all the stimulus, shows that investors are nervous. Usually higher growth means higher yields, but it's the opposite in China right now.
And Goldman Sachs has been sounding the alarm too, right? Comparing China to Japan.
Yeah, they're basically saying, hey, learn from Japan's mistakes. They point to all these parallels.
Yeah.
The real estate crash, the debt, weak investment, weak consumption, the aging population. It's a pretty dire warning.
And I think someone even used the term balance sheet recession to describe what might be happening in China.
Yeah, the chief economist at Nomura Research Institute said that. Basically, it means that companies and households are so focused on paying down debt and saving money that they're not investing or spending, even though interest rates are low. They're trying to fix their balance sheets after years of borrowing and asset bubbles. And when everyone's doing that, the economy stalls no matter what the government does.
So it's like a self-fulfilling prophecy. People are scared, so they hoard cash, and that makes the situation worse.
Exactly. And it's interesting because China might be trying to manage this debt problem globally through things like the Belt and Road Initiative.
The BRI. So the idea is that they're basically exporting their debt.
Kinda. They're lending huge sums to developing countries for infrastructure projects, but it's all financed by Chinese banks and lenders. And in return, China gets access to resources, trade deals, all that. Some people even call these countries tributary states.
So it's like a new form of colonialism almost.
Some people see it that way, yeah. But it's also a way for China to keep its own factories humming, to find new markets for its goods.
And hasn't India been a major thorn in China's side when it comes to the BRI?
Big time. India's been really vocal about the risks of these BRI loans, how they could trap countries in debt, and they've pointed out the lack of transparency in a lot of these projects. It's interesting because India has a huge trade deficit with China, but they're not afraid to call them out on this.
So it's not just about economics. There's a geopolitical angle to this as well.
Absolutely. And it's not just India. There's this whole idea of a multipolar world emerging, where you have different blocks of countries with their own interests and alliances. And the U.S. is definitely trying to build its own bloc to counter China's influence.
So it's a very dynamic, very uncertain time. And what about the average Chinese citizen? How are they being affected by all this?
Well, there's been this trend of wealthy Chinese moving their money and even themselves out of the country, looking for safer havens. Meanwhile, the middle class, a lot of them have put their savings into real estate, which is now tanking. And all that infrastructure they built, some of it's not even being used.
So there's a lot of anxiety, a lot of uncertainty about the future.
Yeah, definitely. And there was this really stark quote from Scott Bessent, a former U.S. Treasury official. He said that China's already in a severe recession depression and that they're trying to export their way out of it.
Wow. And we've also seen China selling off some of its U.S. Treasury bonds, right? What's the story there?
Yeah, they've been gradually reducing their holdings. It could be a way to diversify their reserves to become less dependent on the U.S. dollar. It also gives them more flexibility to trade with other countries, like Russia, maybe even using other currencies.
So they're hedging their bets, preparing for a different world order.
That's a good way to put it. And even the recent thaw in relations between China and India could be part of this. By improving ties with India, China might be trying to secure a new market and offset some of the pressure from the U.S.
So it's like a giant game of chess with all these moving pieces and complex strategies.
That's a great analogy. And at the heart of it all is this fundamental question: can China shift from an export-driven economy to one that relies more on domestic consumption? Because if they can't, they're in big trouble.
It's like they built this incredible machine, but it only runs on one type of fuel, and that fuel is starting to run out.
Exactly. And the rest of the world is watching, wondering what happens next. It's a truly fascinating and potentially very consequential moment in history.
So to wrap things up, for our listeners out there, what are the key things to remember from all of this?
Okay, so the big takeaways are deflation, it's here, and it's persistent. The debt problem, it's massive, it's complex, and it's not going away anytime soon. The middle income trap, China's facing it head on, and it's a tough one to escape. And finally, the global impact, whatever happens in China, is going to ripple out and affect the whole world.
And on that note, here's something to think about. Given all these challenges, all these moving pieces, how do you think the global balance of power is going to shift in the next decade? What unexpected things might happen? It's a question worth pondering because the future is far from certain, and that's what makes it so interesting.